has given the most remarkable, devoted service to the Queen, to my family, and to the country, and also to the whole of the Commonwealth.
The crown does not bleed, but the family does. When the ink dried on the final order, 2 innocent names were erased from tomorrow, leaving a father holding the ashes of his birthright and a king carrying the cold, crushing weight of history. The news did not arrive with a gentle knock or a polite whisper. It hit like a seismic tremor, vibrating through the pockets of journalists, flashing across digital screens in London, New York, and Sydney simultaneously. A synchronized chorus of breaking alerts echoed through quiet newsrooms and crowded morning commutes. In a matter of seconds, a tidal wave of push notifications transformed a seemingly ordinary day into a historic rupture. The digital avalanche carried a single, devastating headline, moving faster than any royal scandal before it. It was the kind of announcement that forces the collective world to stop, hold its breath, and stare. News anchors across the globe paused mid-sentence, pressing fingers to their earpieces as producers scrambled to feed them the unprecedented bulletins. Printing presses that had been rolling out the evening editions abruptly halted, clearing their front pages for a constitutional earthquake. The world watched in real time as the bedrock of a 1,000-year-old institution shifted irrevocably. But thousands of miles away from the frantic energy of global media hubs, inside a sun-drenched estate in California, there was no chaotic buzzing. There was only a suffocating, unbearable silence. The notification had arrived there too, but for the couple standing in the vast, immaculate living room, it was not breaking news. It was the sound of an ancient, heavy iron gate slamming shut forever. To understand the magnitude of this fracture, one must look at the 2 vastly distinct worlds it divided. In London, the sky wept a steady, miserable drizzle over the dark iron gates of Buckingham Palace. The ancient stones of the royal residence seemed to absorb the moisture, standing as a cold, immovable fortress of tradition. The palace guards remained motionless, rain dripping from their visors, entirely indifferent to the frantic camera crews assembling just beyond the barricades. The atmosphere around the palace was thick, with the scent of wet asphalt and centuries of unyielding protocol. It was a fortress that had survived world wars, abdications, and public disgrace by adhering to one ruthless, unspoken principle. The survival of the institution absolutely outranks the survival of the individual. Across the ocean, the contrast could not have been more striking. Montecito basked in an aggressive, golden light. The air was warm, scented with eucalyptus, blooming jasmine, and ocean salt. The sprawling Californian mansion was specifically designed for freedom, a sanctuary built on the promise of escaping the very walls that were now projecting their dark shadow across the Atlantic. Yet, beneath the high, vaulted ceilings of their private refuge, the streaming sunlight offered absolutely no warmth. The sprawling windows, meant to frame a life of boundless opportunity and peace, suddenly felt like the transparent walls of an isolation chamber. Inside that house, the concept of time seemed to warp and freeze. The physical distance between London and California spanned thousands of miles, but in the agonizing minutes following the announcement, that vast geography collapsed. The long, punishing arm of the crown had reached across the ocean, bypassing time zones, oceans, and borders, to deliver a surgical blow directly to the heart of their new life. This was not another tabloid rumor bred from the whispers of unnamed courtiers. It was not a speculative column tucked away in the Sunday papers, nor was it a temporary punishment meant to teach a lesson. This was a calculated strike executed by the highest echelons of the British state. The statement released by the palace communications team was brief, utterly devoid of flowery language, and entirely stripped of emotional padding. It was drafted with the lethal, clinical precision of constitutional lawyers. Archie and Lilibet, 2 innocent children born into the most heavily scrutinized family on planet Earth, had been officially and permanently removed from the royal line of succession. To the casual observer, it might have seemed like a mere clerical update, the shuffling of names on an antiquated, irrelevant list. But those who understood the brutal, unyielding machinery of the monarchy knew the terrifying truth. The line of succession is not just a roster, it is the very spine of the monarchy, an unbroken chain of blood, duty, and divine right that dictates the future of the realm. To erase 2 names from that sacred ledger is to rewrite history before it is even allowed to happen. It was an unprecedented act of institutional self-preservation, a definitive declaration that royal blood alone no longer guarantees a place within the sanctuary of the crown. The palace had crossed the Rubicon. They were no longer merely distancing the institution from a fractured family dynamic. They were amputating a lineage to prevent what they viewed as a future infection of their sacred order. For the Duke, the reality of the decree settled into his bones like a deep winter chill. The screen of the phone lying on the marble kitchen island had gone completely dark, but the words were already burned into his retinas. He knew the inner workings of the palace better than anyone. He knew that an edict like this required months of silent, covert planning. It meant that while he had been pleading for understanding, the men in gray suits had been drafting his children's exile. For the Duchess, the decree felt like a physical violation. The protective fury of a mother ignited immediately, battling against the overwhelming shock. She realized in an instant that her children, who had never asked for titles or public scrutiny, had been weaponized by an institution she fundamentally mistrusted. They were being punished for the defiance of their parents, their birthrights stripped away to serve as a brutal warning to anyone who dared challenge the sovereign. This was the terrifying shock of finality. For months, perhaps years, there had always been an underlying assumption, a desperate, unspoken hope that beneath the anger, the explosive interviews, and the endless public sparring, a safety net of family remained intact. There was an illusion that no matter how fiercely the adults battled, the children would remain untouchable, shielded by their grandfather's underlying love and their inherent right by birth. That illusion was now entirely shattered into jagged pieces. The palace had not just issued a reprimand, they had issued an eviction notice from history. There would be no more emergency family summits at royal estates. There would be no back-channel negotiations mediated by anxious aides in dimly lit corridors. The time for private calls seeking compromise had evaporated into thin air. The realization hit with agonizing clarity. The institution they had sought to reform, the system they had fled to protect their sanity, had responded by quietly locking the door behind them and throwing the key into the abyss. The future they had envisioned, where their children could exist safely on the periphery of royalty without bearing its crushing weight, had been systematically dismantled. The decree was absolute. The battle was over, and in the deafening silence of their California home, the terrifying reality took hold. They were completely, irreversibly on their own. The air inside the Montecito estate grew unnaturally thin. It was the kind of atmospheric shift that precedes a devastating storm, a heavy, suffocating pressure that makes drawing breath feel like a conscious, agonizing labor. The digital phantom of the palace decree lingered in the room long after the phone screen had surrendered to darkness. In the vast expanse of their meticulously curated kitchen, surrounded by the quiet hum of modern luxury, two figures stood entirely paralyzed by the archaic, ruthless machinery of an institution thousands of miles away. Meghan stood rooted to the reclaimed oak floorboards, her posture rigidly straight, every muscle coiled with a terrifying, protective tension. For a fleeting moment, a ghost of disbelief had flickered behind her eyes, a desperate instinct to reject the undeniable reality. But that disbelief was instantly incinerated by a sudden, consuming inferno of maternal fury. She did not weep. Tears were a luxury afforded to those who had the space to mourn. She only had the space to defend. She looked toward the hallway leading to the west wing of the estate, where the faint, melodic sounds of her children playing echoed softly against the plaster walls. They were entirely oblivious to the fact that their names had just been etched into the annals of constitutional history as casualties of a royal war. To the Duchess, the decree was not a matter of high statecraft or constitutional preservation. It was a deeply personal, remarkably vindictive retaliation. She saw the absolute cruelty of weaponizing two innocent toddlers, children who had never bowed on a balcony, never waved to a sea of Union Jacks, and never asked to be born into the most complicated family dynamic on earth. In her mind, the palace had not acted out of duty. They had acted out of spite. They had meticulously calculated the one angle of attack that would inflict the most profound, lingering pain. The institution she had once tried to modernize, the family she had believed could eventually expand its rigid definitions of belonging, had instead contracted into a defensive, impenetrable fortress. They had drawn a boundary in the sand, and they had painted it with the erased legacies of her son and daughter. Meghan's jaw set into a hard, unyielding line. The palace wanted to cast her children as permanent outsiders, but in doing so, they had inadvertently handed her the ultimate justification for their departure. The institution was no longer a lost opportunity. It was a confirmed adversary. Across the room, the Duke remained anchored to the edge of a linen sofa, staring into the middle distance, as if watching a ghost slowly materialize in the morning light. Harry did not feel the sudden surge of rage that fortified his wife. Instead, he was drowning in a hollow, sinking despair, a profound psychological amputation. He looked at his own hands, the hands of a man raised to believe that his blood was a permanent, unbreakable covenant with history. He had spent his entire life serving the sovereign, flying combat missions, smiling for endless flashing cameras, and enduring the suffocating grip of public ownership, all under the absolute certainty that his lineage was sacred. He remembered the echoing halls of Windsor, the stern oil portraits of ancestors who had sacrificed everything for the continuity of the line. Now, his children would never look at those portraits and see their own undeniable reflection. The very institution that had forged his identity, the same entity that had wrapped him in velvet and sorrow since he was a young boy walking behind a casket, had surgically removed his lineage from existence. The realization crashed over him with the weight of an ocean wave. The firm was not a family. It was a corporation, a cold, calculating machine that recognized no sons, no brothers, and no grandsons when its own survival was perceived to be threatened. Harry realized, with a sickening clarity, that the shield of his birthright had never been permanent. It had merely been conditional. The choices he had made years prior, the desperate scramble for freedom, the explosive televised confessions, the memoirs that laid bare the darkest corners of royal life, all of it had been an attempt to seize control of his own narrative. He had believed he was engaging in a righteous rebellion against a toxic press and an unsupportive establishment. But sitting in the quiet devastation of his Californian exile, the true cost of that rebellion was finally presented to him on a silver platter. He had aimed for the walls of the palace, but the shrapnel had torn through the future of his own children. The guilt was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest, demanding to be acknowledged. He had sought to protect them from the crushing burden of the crown, but he had never imagined the crown would retaliate by stripping them of their history entirely. In the heavy, oppressive silence of the room, there was a profound absence of accusation. Another couple, less weathered by the relentless storms of public scrutiny, might have turned on one another. There could have been shouted recriminations, tearful interrogations about who was truly to blame for the bridge collapsing behind them. But Harry and Meghan did not scream. They did not exchange bitter words or assign blame for the catastrophe that had just engulfed them. They were united by a shared, traumatic epiphany. The choices they had made were irreversible, and the consequences had arrived in their purest, most unforgiving form. They looked at each other across the expanse of the room, a silent communication passing between them that required no syllables. The trauma of their shared exile bound them tighter than any spoken vow. They were entirely alone on an island of their own making, alienated from the kingdom that had defined his past and the institution that had complicated her present. The bridge connecting them to the ancient, damp corridors of royal power was not just burning. It had been detonated into dust. The ashes were currently raining down across the globe in the form of breaking news, banners, and breathless commentary. The royal line of succession had been severed, and with it, the final, fragile thread of hope for a future reconciliation. They were now fully and completely untethered. The fortress of their home in Montecito, once a symbol of their hard-won liberation, suddenly felt like a beautifully gilded bunker. The war they thought they had left behind had simply changed its battlefield, shifting from the tabloids to the very constitutional bedrock of the United Kingdom. And as the morning sun continued to pour through the pristine windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the silent air, the Duke and Duchess of Sussex braced themselves for a lifetime of living entirely outside the fortress they had once called home. Far from the golden, sun-baked coast of California, the atmosphere within the ancient, formidable stone walls of the royal estate was entirely devoid of warmth. The Prince of Wales stood motionless before a towering, rain-streaked window, his hands clasped firmly behind his back in a rigid posture drilled into his very muscle memory since boyhood. He was not looking at the manicured, sprawling gardens below, nor was he watching the ominous, slate-gray clouds rolling mercilessly across the English sky. He was staring into the invisible, terrifying expanse of the future. The public narrative, rapidly spinning out of control in the hands of eager commentators and hungry tabloids, would inevitably attempt to paint him as the cold-hearted villain of this constitutional saga. They would frame him as the jealous, hardened older brother executing a ruthless, personal vendetta. But within the quiet, sacred solitude of his private study, there was absolutely no malice in his heart. There was only the crushing, suffocating gravity of duty. William was no longer merely a sibling or a son. He was the primary architect of the monarchy's survival. Every agonizing decision he made now was a heavy stone laid on the path his own heirs would one day be forced to walk. The decree that had just shattered the world's morning broadcasts was not an act of sudden, blinding anger. It was the bloody culmination of a grueling, philosophical war that had raged behind closed, soundproof doors for years. The absolute core of the argument was a terrifying question of precedent. Could the sacred, ancient privileges of royal status exist entirely divorced from the grueling, unrelenting sacrifices of royal duty? For the future king, the answer was an absolute, unequivocal denial. To allow an exiled branch of the family to retain their proximity to the throne while actively dismantling the institution from a safe, lucrative distance was not just deeply hypocritical, it was an existential threat to the crown itself. If the proposed half-in, half-out model were allowed to stand, William believed the very fabric of the monarchy would rapidly unravel. Future generations would look back to this exact moment as the fatal crack that shattered the constitutional glass. Why should any future royal dedicate their entire life to the relentless, unforgiving grind of public service, enduring the absolute loss of privacy, if they could simply walk away, keep the majestic titles, and monetize their proximity to the sovereign? The Prince of Wales knew, with a terrifying certainty, that the boundary had to be drawn with absolute, unyielding permanence. He was not acting for his own sake, but for the sake of his children. George, Charlotte, and Louis were already stepping onto the heavily scrutinized, brilliantly lit stage of royal life, carrying a burden they were still too young to fully comprehend. William's greatest, most paralyzing terror was handing them a broken, hollowed-out institution constantly at war with its own rogue factions. By officially amputating the Sussex lineage from the royal line of succession, he was performing a brutal, preemptive surgery. He was cutting away the infection of ambiguity to ensure that when the crown eventually descended upon his eldest son's head, the rules of belonging were carved in immovable stone. Duty could not be a part-time endeavor. Loyalty could not be conditional. The survival of the thousand-year-old establishment demanded absolute, unflinching surrender. Yet, beneath the impenetrable armor of the future king, the agonizing sorrow of a brother bled silently into the shadows. The world saw a stoic, resolute statesman defending the realm, but the internal landscape of his mind was a tragic graveyard of cherished, irrecoverable memories. He remembered a time when they were just two young boys, inextricably bound together by the blinding flashbulbs of an aggressive press and the shared, unspeakable trauma of a mother lost far too soon. They had once promised, in the quietest corners of their youth, to stand shoulder to shoulder against the isolating cold of the world. Now, he was the very instrument wielding the heavy blade that severed his brother's bloodline from history. It was a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions, a man forced by destiny to choose his country over his own kin. The pain was not explosive or fiery. It was a dull, constant ache deep within his marrow. He had successfully protected the realm, but he had lost his only brother forever. The victory tasted entirely of ash. The heavy, carved oak door of the study opened with a soft, barely perceptible creak, breaking the agonizing silence that had swallowed the room. The Princess of Wales stepped over the threshold, moving with a quiet, grounding grace. Catherine did not offer immediate platitudes, nor did she ask if he was all right, because the answer was painfully obvious. She possessed an intuitive, profound understanding of the immense, isolating toll this ruthless necessity was taking on her husband's soul. She crossed the vast expanse of the room and stood quietly beside him, her presence serving as a silent, unwavering fortress against the encroaching storm. She knew better than anyone the agonizing human cost of this constitutional clarity. She had watched the emotional toll etch deep, new lines around William's eyes over the past weeks, watching him silently absorb the immense guilt of a decision he fundamentally believed was right. Without uttering a single syllable, Catherine reached out and placed a steady, gentle hand on his arm. It was a gesture of profound solidarity, a quiet acknowledgement of the terrible, crushing burden they now carried together. She, too, mourned the devastating fracture of the family. She mourned for the two young children across the ocean, who would grow up entirely severed from their heritage, innocent casualties of an ideological war they had absolutely no part in creating. But as a mother who would one day see her own son crowned, she also understood the brutal, unforgiving mathematics of the monarchy. To protect the sanctity of the many, the few must sometimes be sacrificed. William covered her hand with his own, his grip tightening significantly, betraying the immense emotional turbulence churning violently beneath his composed exterior. Together, they looked out through the rain-battered glass, watching the ancient grounds of the estate weather yet another bitter storm. The decree was out in the world. The irreversible machinery of state had executed its brutal directive. William had stepped fully into the role destiny had carved out for him, embracing the cold, unyielding logic required of a sovereign in waiting. The architect of duty had fortified the walls of the kingdom, ensuring the foundation remained crackless for the generations yet to come. But as the gray, unforgiving light of the English morning filtered into the room, casting long, solemn shadows across the polished floorboards, the Prince of Wales closed his eyes against the stinging realization. He was securing the future of the crown, but the ghost of his shattered brotherhood would haunt these hallowed halls for the rest of his life. Deep within the labyrinthine corridors of the royal residence, far removed from the flashing cameras and the frantic whispers of the press corps, the sovereign sat entirely alone. The grand, cavernous study was steeped in a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the rhythmic, unyielding ticking of an antique mahogany clock resting upon the mantelpiece. Each tick felt like a physical blow, a relentless reminder that time was rapidly slipping through his fingers, pushing him toward a precipice from which there could be absolutely no return. Seated behind an expansive, polished desk that had borne witness to centuries of declarations, treaties, and royal edicts, King Charles stared down at the crisp, unforgiving parchment resting before him. It was a single sheet of paper, bearing the heavy, embossed crest of the monarchy, but it held the destructive power of 1,000 cannons. Beside the document lay a gold-nibbed fountain pen, resting perfectly parallel to the edge of the desk. To the rest of the world, Charles was the ultimate authority, the very embodiment of the state, a man born to wear the heavy jewels of an ancient empire. But in this agonizing, isolated moment, he was profoundly, painfully human. He was an aging patriarch, a father whose heart was currently being torn into jagged, irreconcilable pieces. He was not paralyzed by indecision. The agonizing debates, the legal reviews, the constitutional arguments, all of that was already finished. The decision had been solidified. He was paralyzed, instead, by a bottomless, crushing sorrow. As his tired eyes scanned the carefully typed, brutally clinical language of the decree, the ghosts of his own past began to materialize in the quiet shadows of the room. Throughout his entire life, he had intimate, painful knowledge of the sacrifices demanded by the crown. He remembered the suffocating rigidity of his youth, the agonizing moments when his own personal desires, his own desperate need for love and understanding, were mercilessly crushed beneath the immovable wheels of royal duty. He had endured decades of waiting, decades of swallowing his own voice, bearing the immense weight of expectations that often felt more like a gilded cage than a divine privilege. He had once made a silent, hopeful promise to his own soul that when his time finally came to take the throne, he would be a different kind of ruler. He had dreamed of being a modern, compassionate king, a patriarch who could finally bridge the agonizing gap between the cold institution and the beating heart of his family. Yet, staring at the document that would officially erase his own flesh and blood from the sacred line of succession, the bitter irony choked him. The system he now commanded was turning him into the very enforcer of the ruthless rigidity that had once made him suffer so deeply. He was wielding the exact same constitutional blade that had scarred his own heart decades prior. The realization was a poison slowly seeping into his veins. The crown does not bend to the whims of the heart, it demands absolute submission. It requires the wearer to burn their own personal attachments on the altar of public duty. The phantom whispers of his constitutional advisors seemed to echo in the vast emptiness of the study. He could still hear the polite, lethal murmurs of the men in perfectly tailored gray suits who had presented this final draft to him mere hours ago. They did not shout or command. Courtiers never do. Instead, they wielded precedent like a perfectly sharpened scalpel. They spoke smoothly of constitutional integrity, of preserving the undisputed clarity of the succession, of protecting the realm from future ideological civil wars. "Hesitation is vulnerability, Your Majesty," they had warned, their voices smooth as glass. "The monarchy cannot afford ambiguity. The survival of the institution relies entirely upon absolute certainty." They were right, of course. The brutal, inescapable logic of statecraft dictated that a royal lineage operating entirely outside the boundaries of royal service was a ticking time bomb. The king understood the political necessity perfectly. He understood his eldest son's fierce, protective stance regarding the future. But understanding the logic did not stop the agonizing bleeding in his chest. The courtiers only saw a constitutional loophole that needed to be surgically sealed. Charles saw the bright, innocent faces of two small children living an ocean away. Grandchildren he barely knew, yet loved with a quiet, desperate ferocity in the most private corners of his soul. He closed his eyes, and an image of his youngest son flashed brightly against the darkness of his eyelids. The boy who had walked behind a coffin. The boy who had struggled so profoundly to find his place within the towering shadows of his ancestors. Signing this decree meant taking the final, fatal step across a boundary that could never, ever be uncrossed. It meant that his darling boy would look across the ocean and see not a loving father, but a ruthless executioner. It meant confirming every dark, fearful suspicion his son had ever harbored about the coldness of the royal machine. The king was acutely aware that by protecting his country, he was utterly destroying his family. The agonizing war between the heart of a grandfather and the soul of a sovereign raged fiercely within the confines of his own mind. He desperately wanted to push the paper away, to demand another delay, to summon his lawyers and beg for a softer, kinder alternative. But there were no alternatives left. The time for quiet settlements and gentle compromises had evaporated. The world was watching, the government was waiting, and the heavy, immovable machinery of the palace required his final authorization to release the statement that would alter history. With a hand that trembled slightly with the weight of his age and his grief, King Charles reached out and picked up the gold fountain pen. The metal felt as cold as ice against his skin. He took a long, shuddering breath, filling his lungs with the heavy, historic air of the room, and lowered the nib to the parchment. The scratching sound of the ink permanently binding the royal seal to the paper was deafening in the quiet study. Each letter of his signature felt like a physical puncture wound to his own chest. When the final loop of his name was completed, he did not immediately lift his head. He slowly laid the pen down, resting it exactly where he had found it. The deed was finally done. The terrifying precedent had been set. Archie and Lilibet were officially, irrevocably removed from the future of the monarchy. The kingdom had been protected. The sacred lineage had been secured. But as the king sat alone in the creeping dusk, surrounded by the towering, oil-painted portraits of ancestors who had made the exact same brutal bargains, he wept silently. He had successfully saved the crown, but the man wearing it was shattered beyond repair. What elements of the palace's invisible machinery would you like to focus on as we transition into Part 5? While the sovereign wept in the gilded, heavy solitude of his study, a completely different reality was unfolding just a few floors below him. The monarchy is often mistaken by the public as a mere family, a collection of human beings bound by blood, prone to the same jealousies, heartbreaks, and reconciliations as any normal household. But that is the grand illusion. Beneath the velvet robes, the glittering tiaras, and the emotional turmoil of its visible figureheads, the crown is a leviathan. It is a 1,000-year-old corporation, a sprawling, unsentimental bureaucracy designed with one singular, terrifying purpose: endless survival. This is the realm of the invisible machinery, operated by the quiet, formidably intelligent courtiers, often referred to simply as the men in gray suits. These advisors, constitutional lawyers, and private secretaries do not operate on passion. They do not feel the sting of a brother's betrayal or the profound sorrow of a grandfather's loss. They are the institutional immune system. When the body of the monarchy detects a threat, they do not hesitate, and they do not mourn. They systematically neutralize it. The decree that had just shattered the morning news cycle was not drafted in a fit of royal rage. It was the product of hundreds of hours of meticulous, cold-blooded legal surgery, conducted in sterile, windowless offices buried deep within the palace archives. To understand the terrifying efficiency of this machinery, one must look back at the anatomy of the decision. It did not begin with a dramatic confrontation or a shouting match across a dining table. It began months prior, as a quiet, hypothetical memorandum circulated among the most senior constitutional scholars in the country. Following a series of highly publicized media appearances by the Duke and Duchess across the Atlantic, a vulnerability was flagged. The scholars noted that allowing individuals entirely detached from royal obligations to remain elevated within the highest echelons of the succession created a dangerous constitutional paradox. If an unprecedented tragedy were to occur, wiping out the direct line, the United Kingdom could theoretically be legally bound to a monarch residing in California, possessing no allegiance to the working structure of the state. For the invisible machinery, this was not a matter of family drama. It was an unacceptable margin of error. The lawyers began pulling heavy, leather-bound volumes of ancient precedent, studying the Act of Settlement and historic declarations of treason and abdication. They built a waterproof, legally binding framework to execute an amputation. They drafted risk assessments, calculated global public relations fallouts, and prepared statements completely devoid of human warmth. They turned the messy, bleeding wound of a family dispute into a pristine, executable legal directive. Yet, even the most ruthless bureaucracy offers a warning before it drops the axe. Deep within the internal logs of the palace, There existed the record of a final, unheeded ultimatum. Many months before the ink ever touched the final decree, a highly secure, encrypted phone call had been arranged between a senior palace courtier and the Duke. The aide did not raise his voice. He did not threaten or scold. In the polite, impeccably measured tone of a career diplomat, he had informed the Duke that the current arrangement was being audited for its long-term constitutional viability. He gently suggested that an active, voluntary renunciation of the children's succession rights might be a more dignified path forward than forcing the crown to legally intervene. The Duke, blinded by his own grief and fueled by a deep-seated belief that his bloodline would ultimately grant him immunity, dismissed the warning as a manipulative bluff. He believed his father would never allow the bureaucracy to strike his children. But the fatal miscalculation was failing to realize that the father and the sovereign were no longer the same entity. The palace does not bluff. When a courtier mentions an audit, the verdict has already been decided. The warning was simply a courtesy, a procedural box ticked before the machinery moved to the execution phase. Once King Charles lifted his golden fountain pen from the parchment, his role in the saga was effectively terminated. The door to the king's study opened silently, and his private secretary stepped in. He did not offer condolences. He simply nodded respectfully, retrieved the heavily embossed document, and placed it inside a nondescript leather folder. The moment that folder crossed the threshold of the study, the emotional weight of the decision evaporated, replaced instantly by the terrifying velocity of institutional protocol. The synchronization of the release was a masterpiece of modern statecraft. Secure lines instantly connected Buckingham Palace to government ministers, key Commonwealth embassies, and the highest ranks of the British media. Press officers stationed at their glowing monitors synchronized their watches, waiting for the precise, predetermined minute to launch the coordinated strike. Webmasters logged into the back end of the official royal websites, their fingers hovering over the delete keys, ready to scrub the digital ledgers clean. There was no shouting, no dramatic countdown, no dramatic crescendo of music. There was only the soft, rhythmic clicking of keyboards and the hushed confirmations spoken into headsets. When the designated hour arrived, a single command was given. In a matter of seconds, the digital architecture of the monarchy was permanently altered. Two names, representing two innocent lives across the ocean, vanished from the official royal website as if they had never existed. The press releases flooded the inboxes of thousands of journalists worldwide simultaneously. The invisible machinery had executed its directive flawlessly, amputating the compromised limb with surgical precision, leaving not a single drop of blood on the pristine carpets of the palace. The crown was secure, and the institution marched relentlessly forward, completely indifferent to the human wreckage left entirely in its wake. Dawn broke over London with a harsh, unforgiving clarity, stripping away the shadows of the night to reveal a capital city entirely consumed by the shockwave. The invisible machinery had done its work in the dark, but the fallout belonged entirely to the blinding light of morning. Newsstands dotting the damp pavements of the city were plastered with identical, inescapable imagery. Every major publication, broadsheet, and tabloid alike carried the exact same narrative weight. Bold, block-lettered headlines screamed from the racks, declaring the absolute finality of the palace's midnight maneuver. Morning television broadcasters, their faces drawn tight with the immense gravity of the moment, dissected the constitutional language of the decree word by agonizing word. The public reaction was instantaneous, explosive, and profoundly fractured. The kingdom, and indeed the world, was immediately cleaved into two deeply entrenched camps. On one side stood the fierce traditionalists, the loyalists who viewed the crown not as a family, but as a sacred pillar of the state. To them, the King and the Prince of Wales had performed a necessary, heroic act of institutional defense. They applauded the ruthless clarity, arguing that the monarchy could not survive if it allowed exiled factions to mock its traditions from the lucrative safety of a Californian mansion. But on the other side of the divide, a massive wave of sorrow and outrage swelled. Millions of onlookers saw nothing heroic in the sterile, legalistic language of the decree. They saw an archaic, unforgiving establishment actively punishing two innocent toddlers. They saw a grandfather choosing a 1,000-year-old corporation over his own flesh and blood. The debate raged across social media platforms, transcending oceans and language barriers. But all the furious digital noise in the world could not reverse the dry ink of the sovereign's pen. Beneath the deafening roar of public opinion, a quieter, far more terrifying reality was taking shape within the quiet, dust-moted libraries of the College of Arms. Here, the royal lineage is not just a digital list. It is a physical, living tapestry woven into giant, leather-bound ledgers. The true horror of the decree was not the media storm. but the literal erasure of tomorrow. When historians look back at this exact moment centuries from now, they will not see the tears, the arguments, or the press releases. They will only see the brutal, unyielding gap in the parchment. Imagine the future of the monarchy, the grand, glittering coronations, the jubilant balcony appearances, the solemn state funerals. In all of these heavily choreographed displays of continuity, there will forever be a haunting void. Archie and Lilibet had been officially transformed into ghosts haunting the margins of British history. They were two empty chairs at the eternal banquet of the kingdom. They would grow up learning about their ancestry not from the warm embrace of relatives, but from history books that explicitly detailed their formal banishment. The palace had not just rewritten the present, they had successfully reached into the future and erased the Sussex bloodline before it ever had a chance to bloom. As the sun reached its zenith, casting long, absolute shadows across two different continents, the ultimate, tragic juxtaposition of this war was fully revealed. In the heart of London, King Charles prepared for his first public engagement since the decree. He stood in a grand, gilded antechamber, surrounded by a dozen meticulous aides who adjusted his heavy, ceremonial lapels and handed him his perfectly typed speech. He was the undisputed victor of the constitutional crisis. He had secured the borders of his realm, protected his heir, and proven to the invisible machinery that he possessed the ruthless strength required of a monarch. Yet, standing amidst the velvet and the gold, he had never been more entirely, agonizingly isolated. He was a sovereign triumphant, but a father utterly defeated. The crown rested securely upon his head, but it felt heavier than it ever had, weighed down by the invisible ghosts of the grandchildren he had just exiled. Thousands of miles away, on the edge of a pristine, sun-drenched Californian cliff, the Duke of Sussex stood completely alone, looking out over the vast, uncaring expanse of the Pacific Ocean. He had spent years fighting for this exact panoramic view of freedom. He had waged a relentless, global war against the British press and the palace establishment to break the generational cycle of pain. He had wanted to give his children a life entirely unburdened by the suffocating expectations of the crown. And in the most twisted, ironic turn of fate imaginable, the palace had granted him exactly what he fought for. His children were now entirely free from the institution. But as the warm ocean breeze washed over him, the victory felt violently hollow. He was a free man, but he was entirely unmoored, drifting in an endless sea with the heavy, ancient anchor of his heritage permanently severed. He had his wife, his children, and his fortress in the hills. But the bridge to his past was gone, reduced to ash and scattered to the wind. The dust finally began to settle on the constitutional earthquake. The invisible machinery of the palace went back to sleep, its objective achieved, waiting silently in the shadows for the next threat to emerge. High above Buckingham Palace, the royal standard caught the harsh afternoon wind, snapping violently against the gray sky, completely unbothered by the human wreckage it presided over. The institution had survived, just as it always does. The crown does not bleed, it does not weep, and it does not regret. It only endures. But families do bleed, and when the definitive history of this modern era is finally written, it will not merely record a brilliant tactical preservation of the monarchy. It will record the exact, heartbreaking moment a family looked at itself across a vast, unforgiving ocean, realized the final bridge had been burned to the ground, and turned their backs forever. The palace made it official. The line was redrawn. But in this merciless war of blood and duty, no one truly won.